Hi, it's V. I'm sorry it's been a little while since I made a video. I've had a couple weeks where I've been down. Social situations have become stressors instead of fun. When I'm manic, can't get enough of people. When I'm like I am now, I wouldn't say I'm in a depressive episode, but objectively I am depressed, and everything is an effort with social situations. Everything causes me a lot of anxiety. Found out, I did a lot of research on the DSM-5 and descriptions of bipolar, and 75% of people who have bipolar have an anxiety disorder as well, which makes a lot of sense for me. And yeah, not being able to answer calls or return texts very easily. Being around people, I just feel inadequate and like I don't have anything to say. And objectively, I can counter these things, but it doesn't really matter. Not objective in my head. So here we go with this video, which is very incongruent with my current mood. I recorded this video on Wednesday and I didn't really like it, so redoing it now. So here we go. This is 13 Mania Vocabulary words, and these come from the DSM-5, and they're helpful to understand if you have bipolar, to know what doctors are saying about you, especially in their notes. And if you don't have bipolar, or if you do, they're helpful to kind of understand what the typical symptoms and course of bipolar disorder are, particularly in the manic phase. So here we go. First of all, we have the definition of mania. The DSM-5 defines it as a mental state of elevated, expansive, or irritable mood and persistently increased level of activity or energy. Basically, when I'm manic, I feel completely uninhibited. Anything that would stop me from doing inappropriate things is dampened a lot. I have lots of energy and really social, tend to be really happy, really expressive. And then we get to what a manic episode is, which is a little different from what mania is. You can have manic symptoms or be manic and not necessarily fit the requirements for a manic episode. I did go over this in kind of even more detail in my What is Bipolar 1 and What is Bipolar 2 video. And looking back at that video, it's pretty embarrassing. I'm wearing basically very clownish makeup, and I definitely didn't have my lighting down or my sound down. Here we go. This is what a manic episode is briefly. It has basically 6 requirements. It's a period with 1, elevated, expansive, or irritable mood. 2, increased goal-directed activity or energy. 3, it lasts longer than a week or requires hospitalization or includes psychosis. So if you have hospitalization or psychosis, you don't need it to last greater than a week. 4, having at least 3 symptoms from the following list. A, increased self-esteem / grandiosity. B, decreased need for sleep. C, increased talkativity and pressured speech. D, racing thoughts or flight of ideas. E, distractibility. F, greater goal-directed activity or psychomotor agitation. G, greater involvement in risky behavior. So the 5th requirement is that it impairs functioning socially or at work or otherwise. 6, it is not attributable to the psychological effects of a substance or better described by another medical condition. Talkativity or whatever I said isn't a word, by the way. So there you go. I've had almost all of those symptoms during my manias. Looking over them, definitely increased self-esteem, as we talked about. And the converse is true. When I'm not in a manic state, and especially when I'm depressed, I have really low self-esteem. And yes, decreased need for sleep I've had, feeling rested after like 3 hours, sometimes even less, definitely talkative, almost pressured speech, like almost absolutely needing to talk most of the time and not being very interruptible, definitely racing thoughts and flight of ideas, things connecting really quickly, and distractible somewhat, like if there's like I very easily can jump from one thing I'm thinking about to another and focus on something that isn't so important. Definitely greater goal-directed activity, particularly with YouTube this last time, in the past, Twitter rampages, and all over, like wanting to shop more and reconnect with people and all sorts of stuff, and greater involvement in risky behavior. I have driven like an idiot. I've gotten minor car crashes, not with other cars, but like getting too fast on ramps particularly, and losing control and hitting a barrier. It's happened in each of my last 2 manic episodes. Really stupid. And also taking like drugs that weren't prescribed to me once, and some other things that were very stupid and risky. So there you go. Manic episode. That's the definition in the DSM-5, and that's kind of my... I've had all of it, and several lasting greater than a week, and definitely impaired functioning at work, socially, pissed some people off, and thought I was doing really well at work once when I was absolutely not. The other manic episodes I've had, I was not employed, so that wasn't a problem. And it's a debate whether mine were partially the result of a substance. I was on antidepressants before each of my 2 kind of manic episodes, and that could be it could be that they really weren't legit manic episodes because of that. But the DSM-5 basically says that with antidepressants specifically, if the manic episode lasts at all past the physiological effects of the antidepressants, it is a manic episode. And in each of those cases, the manic symptoms, and I met the requirements for a manic episode days, weeks past when the drugs should have stopped having a real effect. So I guess it counts. I'm a little questioning of that. I think perhaps I have bipolar 2, and the bipolar 1 symptoms only came about because of the antidepressants. But we'll see as things go on, as I will not be going back on antidepressants because I know now that even a small dose throws me into crazy town. By the way, if you don't have bipolar or a mental illness, do not use crazy to define people. But I feel like if you do have a mental illness, you are totally free to reclaim that word and use it ironically as much as you want. Okay. Also important to understand in understanding bipolar and mania, also depression, is what the DSM-5 considers a mood to be. This varies based on the context. So the DSM-5 describes mood as a pervasive and sustained emotion that colors the perception of the world. Common examples of mood include elation, anger, and anxiety. The DSM-5 contrasts it to affect, which refers to more fluctuating changes in emotional weather, whereas mood is basically the emotional climate in this metaphor that it gives. So that's a mood. Definitely have fluctuations in mood in bipolar. Times of depression, elation, which is basically extreme happiness, anger, and definitely anxiety. The anger can come about in manic episodes or depressive episodes. Basically, if there's a lot of anger, in a manic episode that keeps switching between the anger and the darkness and then more elevated mood, expansive mood. It's called a manic episode with mixed features, but that'll be another video likely about that because it's quite a thing. I haven't had much of that specific mixed features component to my manias, but I've had a little. Okay, so going along with mood, it is important to understand it lists 3 different moods that can be characteristic of a manic episode, or required actually for a manic episode. Those are elevated, which is pretty straightforward, irritable, which is pretty straightforward, but also expansive. Expansive mood, it doesn't have a clear definition in the DSM-5 really, so I looked on oxfordreference.com and allydog.com, which is a psychology student study resource site, and if you kind of merge those definitions, you get extreme expression of emotion characterized by inflated self-importance and exaggerated behaviors, enthusiasm and excessively friendly behavior, being grandiose, superior, or larger than life. So I definitely had elements of this in my manic episodes, being very expressive with my emotions, having my heart on my sleeve even more than normally. I'm a pretty open person. I really like talking about emotions and things, but I was pretty much inappropriately so with anyone who would listen. And in this definition of expansive mood, grandiosity is brought up, which is defined by the DSM-5 as believing that one is superior to others and deserves special treatment, self-centeredness, feelings of entitlement, condescension towards others. I don't believe I had a whole lot of this in my manic episodes. I am a pretty humble person in general. I, if anything, think I'm inferior to other people, and even in a manic episode, I felt like I was more in tune with myself than most other people and more electric and energetic, but I didn't think I was better than other people. I really felt like everyone had something to teach me during my manic episodes. But I can see how one could easily flip to grandiosity. For example, I, at some periods in my first one, psychotically thought I was God. In that, I didn't really even then think I was better than everyone else. I kind of thought that everyone was God, but at the same, it didn't make a lot of sense. I also thought basically I was the only God and that I was going to get killed and all this stuff. But it was more like a feeling like anything that I thought would come true, which the DSM-5 kind of defines as magical thinking, which has several definitions based on the context. This is not one of the 13 words, but it basically describes magical thinking as a person believing that their thoughts affect the world, just thinking them. I think that is a lot more characteristic and described in schizophrenia than in bipolar. But there's a lot of overlap in some of the bipolar symptoms that can happen and schizophrenia. But that's a whole digression. There's so much in the DSM-5. It's really interesting to read. Digressing more, it's a little bit of a question whether it could be harmful reading about all the possible symptoms of a disease, because it is possible that one could have those symptoms happen because one expects them. It's really common for therapists and people in the psych field to tell you that people have symptoms and have specifically reactions to medications that they kind of want to have to prove that they shouldn't be on that medication. And people have told me that usually the people with the most side effects are people that just aren't ready for the medication. It's very much of a debate Whether that's real or not, some people think that's really condescending and is just made up by health professionals, but it's surprising how many people have expressed that to me that are medical professionals. I also read a kind of very condescending book that I do not recommend. I'll mention the title, I guess. It was called Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche. And in it, the author's basic hypothesis is that many mental disorders are cries for help, and people genuinely have the symptoms, but they conform their symptoms to accepted definitions of mental disorders for the most part to be able to be recognized for their pain, which obviously is not true of all mental disorders. Maybe it's not true of any, but it kind of draws the link to hysteria historically and how people genuinely had the symptoms of hysteria, but we don't see hysteria as a mental disorder anymore, and a lot of those symptoms that so many people had back in the day have completely disappeared for the most part, or basically disappeared. And yes, there were people who didn't have hysteria that were labeled as having hysteria. That's, again, a whole nother digression. So let's get back to the 13 definitions. Next in the symptoms list, flight of ideas is brought up. This is a fun one. This goes along with the racing thoughts, and the racing thoughts part is the actually experience, subjective experience. Flight of ideas is an observable thing, at least as it is described in the DSM-5. It says a flight of ideas is a nearly continuous flow of accelerated speech with abrupt changes from topic to topic that are usually based on understandable associations, distracting stimuli, or plays on words. When the condition is severe, speech may be disorganized and incoherent. Everything feels connected in this state for me, and each connection feels like a burst of inspiration, and I just want to communicate it to someone else before it slips away. So I had phone calls with friends who I hadn't talked to in a while, talking about the physics of the Earth, and if the Earth was perfectly round, that maybe life couldn't have existed, and drawing that to ideas of everything being this, trying to be a sphere in nature, but not being a perfect sphere, because then that wouldn't have an energetic component to it, and then drawing that to gender, and drawing that to all sorts of different sectors of philosophy and life. And that was like an organized stream of ideas comparatively to some of them that I've had in a manic episode. And just not shutting up, being hard to interrupt. So the next one that I wanted to define is a phrase that they use, psychomotor agitation. DSM-5 says this is excessive motor activity associated with feelings of inner tension. The activity usually is unproductive and repetitious and consists of behaviors such as pacing, fidgeting, wringing of the hands, pulling of the clothes, and inability to sit still. I didn't have a whole lot of this. This is a symptom that you could have this or kind of goal-directed activity. I had a lot more goal-directed activity. I think the psychomotor agitation comes about often when one isn't really able to engage in anything to spend all that extra energy. The times that I did kind of fit these symptoms is when I was in hospitals and I couldn't really do anything. Maybe I was in a waiting situation, or maybe I didn't have anything to write on. I wasn't allowed to record myself. I didn't have access to technology to create anything. The art room was closed, so in those situations I did a lot of pacing, particularly. So, that's a fun one. Psychomotor agitation. Next one, phrase that's kind of useful to define is physiological effects. I mentioned that the episode isn't considered to be a basically legitimate manic episode that is attributable to a diagnosis of bipolar if the symptoms are due to the physiological effects of a drug and last beyond those effects. So, physiological effects isn't defined in the DSM-5, but searching around on the internet, there's, again, in this case, there's pretty much no definitions on even the internet of what physiological effects of a drug means. You can look up physiology, which is the study of the functioning of organs and cells, and one can draw from that the physiological effects of a drug are the changes in functioning of your organs and cells based on drugs you're taking. The one resource that did have a definition of physiological effects of drugs was MESH, which is this database that goes along with PubMed, which is a collection of medical journal articles. And MESH defines physiological effects of drugs as activities which affect organs and systemic functions without regard to a particular disease. So this sheds a little more light that this means that these are the effects of the drug kind of directly and not reactions of the disease to the drugs, which is a little bit of a confusing distinction for me, but it makes a little sense. Like, if an antidepressant kind of cures your depression and it isn't just the immediate, like, what it's doing to your cells and to your brain, then that doesn't count as the physiological effects of the drug, because that lasts beyond taking the drug. There you go. Another important phrase to understand that is in here is hypomania. Hypomania is defined in the DSM-5 as a abnormality of mood resembling mania, but of lesser intensity. So a hypomanic episode is not enough to diagnose bipolar 1. It is required for a diagnosis of bipolar 2, however, and it is basically a less severe form. And when we go to the definition of a hypomanic episode, which again, similar to mania, you can be hypomanic or have hypomanic symptoms without meeting the full requirements for a hypomanic episode. Basically, I would define that, or it seems like the definition for being hypomanic and not being in a hypomanic episode, or conversely, being manic and not being in a full manic episode, is meeting the symptoms requirements in terms of the list of things that hypomania or mania is doing to you, but not meeting the amount of time that is required. So a hypomanic episode is basically the same as a manic episode, but it only needs to last greater than or equal to 4 days. And in a hypomanic episode, it does not significantly impact your functioning in social settings, work settings, or other settings. And it cannot have a hospitalization or psychosis involved. So basically, if it infects your functioning, lands you in the hospital, gives you psychosis, it's a manic episode. If it lasts greater than a week, it's not necessarily a manic episode, which was a mistake I put in my previous video. I corrected it in the description, because if it lasts greater than or equal to a week, but it still doesn't affect your functioning significantly, it's still a hypomanic episode. So you could theoretically have a hypomanic episode that lasts months. I have a friend who has had that happen. I have not. I've had a hypomanic episode, but it did last longer than a week, but I wasn't significantly affected in my social life or in terms of functioning. Okay, so this didn't come up yet, but in the further descriptions of bipolar 1, it talks about lability. So lability is a technical term for rapid shifts in mood over brief periods of time, i.e. the alternation among euphoria, dysphoria, and irritability. So in the DSM-5, euphoria is the normal definition, being really happy, and dysphoria in this situation is not gender dysphoria, it's basically just a bad mood. If we break down the roots, eu is good in euphoria, dys is bad in dysphoria, and for is bearer or bringer. So euphoria in its roots literally means bringer of good, dysphoria means bringer of bad. So digressing again, gender dysphoria is gender being a bringer of bad, basically, if you look at the roots. And then irritability is irritability. So I definitely had some lability in my manic episodes. I could go from being really happy and really excited, for example, about a date and being out with my friend and enjoying, like, kind of planning it, and then going immediately to being very paranoid and thinking that that friend was going to kill me and being really afraid. So that would be lability. Okay. Circling back to moods. The DSM-5 defines 5 moods in particular. Again, it defines a dysphoric mood, an unpleasant mood such as sadness, anxiety, or irritability. They're not super characteristic of manic episodes, but they're more common in depressive episodes, but they can happen. An elevated mood, it defines as an exaggerated feeling of well-being or euphoria or elation. A person with elevated mood may describe feelings of high, ecstatic, on top of the world, or up in the clouds. Lots of elevated mood in my manic episodes, feeling like I could do anything, that I had so much to offer, that I was so authentically me and shining and all that. Then we have euthymic mood. So euthymic mood is very particular to bipolar. It basically defines what some people call a normal mood or a stable mood, basically not being manic or depressed or hypomanic. Defined as mood in the normal range, which implies the absence of depressed or elevated mood. Then we get to expansive mood, which is the lack of restraint in expressing one's feelings, frequently with an over-evaluation of one's significance or importance. So again, they didn't really have a definition of expansive mood previously, but actually they did. Sorry. Then we get to irritable mood, which is being easily annoyed or provoked to anger, which I thankfully have not had a lot of. I have had some, particularly toward my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, and being very quick to get very frustrated and offended by things he did. So those are 13 terms that are kind of important to understanding manic episodes and understanding what doctors are saying in their notes if you have bipolar, and again, understanding people that do have bipolar and are in a manic episode if you don't. Take care, you guys, and goodbye, my beautiful NBs, my strong bipolar friends too, and all of you allies, brazen and free, so long and blessed be.